Well, I fished a little, and golfed a lot. And we were so dumb and green, that's all we played was their music. So they get on stage and, "What are you guys doing?" "We're the Texas Playboys. You're playing our stuff."
George Strait doesn't do the celebrity thing. He doesn't chase headlines or post his every meal on Instagram. He's the king. He stays on the ranch, plays his shows, and keeps his mouth shut. But at 73, something has changed. The loss of Toby Keith cracked the vault. For the first time, George is letting us in on the rowdy, whiskey-soaked, and deeply loyal brotherhood he shared with the loudest man in country music. Let the friendship story unfold. Two titans, one barstool. If you look at them on paper, George Strait and Toby Keith were as different as a quiet Sunday morning in a hill country church and a Saturday night at a dive bar where the cops show up twice. George is the ultimate professional, the king who carries himself with a regal, almost silent dignity. He's got the pressed Wranglers, the starched collar he hasn't changed in 40 years, and a voice that feels like expensive bourbon going down smooth. He's the guy who stays for exactly one drink, shakes every hand in the room with genuine grace, and heads back to the ranch before the trouble starts. Toby was the guy who bought the bar, fired the DJ for not playing enough Merle Haggard, and then dared anyone in the room to do something about it. He was a force of nature, a mountain of a man with a big dog daddy persona that wasn't just a marketing brand, it was his literal DNA. He lived loud, sang louder, and never met a fight he didn't think he could win with a grin and a middle finger. But here's the secret Nashville didn't always see. Under those iconic cowboy hats, these two were cut from the exact same piece of weathered leather. They both had this stubborn, almost pathological need to do things their own way, regardless of what the experts in the glass towers on Music Row had to say about it. In a town that loves to manufacture stars in a lab, George and Toby were the glorious glitches in the system. George did it by refusing to go pop when everyone else was chasing the urban cowboy trend, staying true to the swing and the fiddle. Toby did it by telling the Nashville suits exactly where they could stick their focus groups and spreadsheets. When they were together, that professional distance George usually keeps just evaporated. There's a specific kind of respect that only exists between guys who have seen the top of the mountain and know exactly how much it hurts to climb it. George looked at Toby and saw a songwriter who actually lived the lyrics he wrote, someone who loved the military, the rodeo, and the rough-around-the-edges reality of the American West just as much as he did. They shared a wavelength that didn't require a lot of chatter. It was a brotherhood of few words, usually shared over a cold one or on a quiet golf course far away from the flashing lights. George didn't need Toby to be polished, and Toby didn't need George to be rowdy. They just needed each other to be real. In a world of fake smiles, they were the two biggest silhouettes on the horizon. Toby didn't ask for permission, and George didn't need it. The Oklahoma-Texas border war. In this part of the world, the Red River isn't just a line on a map, it's a battlefront. You've got Texas on one side, represented by the poise and polish of George Strait, and Oklahoma on the other, fueled by the chip-on-the-shoulder swagger of Toby Keith. Usually, that kind of geographical divide is enough to start a fight in any roadside tavern. But between these two, it was the foundation of a legendary, lifelong needle. George is Texas royalty, the kind of guy who represents the wide-open plains and the stoic cowboy code. Toby was pure Oklahoma red dirt, rough, rowdy, and ready to kick the door down if you didn't let him in. On the surface, it was the classic class versus grass matchup, but the rivalry was built on a foundation of bone-deep respect that most people outside of their inner circle never got to see. George used to joke that Toby was the only Oklahoman he'd let across the border without checking his ID, and Toby would fire back that George was the only Texan who didn't spend every waking minute bragging about how everything is bigger in the Lone Star State. It was a playful, constant back and forth that kept them both grounded. While the rest of the world treated George like a living monument, Toby treated him like a guy who just happened to have a lot of #1 hits. That was the beauty of their bond. Toby didn't care about the king title, he cared about the man behind the curtain. He'd poke the bear, crack a joke at George's expense, and wait for that rare, famous George Strait smirk to crawl across his face. This border war wasn't just about sports or state pride, though. It was about their musical identities. George stayed in his lane, perfecting the traditional sound that defined an era. Toby, meanwhile, was constantly pushing boundaries, bringing a rock and roll edge to the country charts. They pushed each other. Seeing Toby's relentless work ethic and his us-against-the-world mentality made George appreciate the grit it took to stay relevant in an industry that's always looking for the next young thing. They were two sides of the same coin, the Texas gentleman and the Oklahoma outlaw. They proved that you don't have to come from the same place to end up at the same destination, as long as you're willing to put in the miles and keep your word. Toby's unfiltered mouth versus George's calculated cool. Why it clicked. Hard truths and cold beer. To understand why a guy like George Strait would gravitate toward a firebrand like Toby Keith, you have to look past the velvet voice and the red solo cup anthems. On the surface, it's an odd couple pairing. George is the master of the calculated cool. He is a man who weighs his words like they're worth an ounce of gold, rarely letting a stray thought slip in public. He's the diplomat of country music, a man who has maintained a pristine image for over 4 decades by knowing exactly when to stay silent. Then you had Toby. Toby Keith didn't just speak his mind, he roared it. He was a man who lived his life unfiltered, a guy who would walk into a room and suck all the oxygen out of it just because he could. He was loud, he was political, and he was fiercely unapologetic about every single thing he did. You'd think George would find that exhausting. In reality, he found it refreshing. In a town like Nashville, where everyone is constantly looking over their shoulder to see if they've offended a sponsor or a radio programmer, Toby was a breath of fresh, dusty air. George admired that Toby didn't have a politeness filter. There was a deep-seated honesty in Toby's brashness that George deeply respected. When they sat down together, usually with a cold beer between them, there was no industry small talk. They didn't sit around discussing chart positions or demographic shifts. They talked about the hard truths. They talked about the songwriting craft, the loneliness of the road, and the difficulty of staying true to yourself when the money starts rolling in. Toby's unfiltered mouth was the perfect foil to George's reserved nature. In their private moments, Toby could say the things that George was perhaps too polite to say out loud. They shared a mutual disdain for the fakers in the business, the guys who wore the hats but didn't know how to work a ranch, or the artists who didn't write their own stories. For George, Toby was a reminder that you could be a massive superstar without losing your edge. For Toby, George was the North Star, the proof that you could be a legend without losing your soul. Their friendship was built on these long, honest conversations that went well into the night. It wasn't always pretty, and they didn't always agree, but it was always real. They also shared a specific kind of blue-collar work ethic that bonded them. Neither man was handed a career on a silver platter. George played the honky-tonks for years before he got his break, and Toby was literally working in the oil fields and playing semi-pro football before he found his way to a microphone. That shared history of manual labor and real-world struggle meant they didn't have much patience for the fluff of the music industry. When they got together, it was about stripping away the glitter and getting back to the basics: a guitar, a story, and a drink. That was their sanctuary. It was the one place where George didn't have to be the king, and Toby didn't have to be the patriot. They could just be two guys who loved country music and hated the BS that often came with it. Then came the news that changed everything. When the cowboy cried, George Strait has spent 40 years perfecting the poker face of country music. He's the man who can stand in front of 80,000 screaming fans and look like he's just waiting for a bus. Calm, collected, and totally in control. But even the strongest dam has a few cracks, and nothing tested George's stoicism quite like watching Toby Keith face down a diagnosis that would have leveled any other man. When the news of Toby's stomach cancer first started trickling through the tight-knit circles of the Nashville elite, most people reacted with shock and public displays of grief. George, true to form, kept it private, but those close to him say it hit him harder than almost anything else in his professional life. It wasn't just that a peer was sick. It was the realization that the invincible Big Dog Daddy was mortal. For George, watching Toby fight was like watching a masterclass in grit. He saw a man who refused to let a terminal illness dictate the terms of his life. Toby didn't go into hiding. He didn't wrap himself in a blanket and wait for the end. He kept showing up. He kept playing. He kept leaning into the wind. George reportedly reached out often, not as a fellow superstar checking on a brand, but as a brother checking on a brother. They spoke about the things men speak about when the clock is ticking: legacy, family, and the fear of what comes after the final curtain call. George has admitted in rare, candid moments that seeing Toby's physical frame shrink while his spirit seemed to grow even larger was one of the most humbling experiences of his 73 years. There is a specific kind of pain in watching someone who lived large have to fight for every breath. And for George, it was a mirror he wasn't quite ready to look into. He saw Toby's defiance as the ultimate outlaw act. While the world was mourning Toby in advance, Toby was busy planning his next move, and George was right there in his corner, offering the kind of quiet, steady support that only a true friend can provide. There were phone calls that lasted longer than usual, filled with a weight that words couldn't quite carry. George watched Toby take the stage at the People's Choice Country Awards, looking thin but standing tall. And for a moment, the King's composure slipped. It wasn't just a performance, it was a goodbye. When the end finally came, the silence from the Strait camp was deafening because George was busy processing a world without his loudest friend. He wasn't interested in a quick tweet or a PR-approved statement. He was grieving the loss of the man who made him laugh when the industry got too serious. He was mourning the loss of a guy who reminded him that, at the end of the day, we're all just cowboys trying to find our way home. The tears George shed weren't for the cameras. They were for the quiet moments on the golf course and the shared jokes that no one else would ever understand. Toby's fight gave George a new perspective on his own time left on this earth. It taught him that you don't have to go quietly into the night, but you do have to go with your head held high. Why their shared love for the troops was the glue of their friendship, the military bond. If you want to find the heartbeat of the friendship between George Strait and Toby Keith, you don't look at the charts or the trophy cases. You look at the men and women wearing camouflage. This wasn't some corporate-sponsored patriotism or a convenient PR move to sell records to the heartland. For these two, supporting the troops was a fundamental part of their identity, a shared mission that went deeper than any hit song. George, a veteran himself, who served in the U.S. Army in the mid-70s while stationed in Hawaii, understood the sacrifice of the uniform in a way that was quiet and respectful. Toby, though he never served in the military, became the ultimate civilian ambassador for the front lines, making it his life's work to bring a piece of home to the most dangerous corners of the globe. George always admired the sheer, unadulterated guts it took for Toby to do what he did. While other artists were playing it safe in air-conditioned arenas, Toby was hopping onto C-130 transport planes and flying into active combat zones in Iraq and Afghanistan. George once remarked that while he sang about the cowboy way of life, Toby was out there living a different kind of bravery, bringing a guitar and a red Solo cup to kids who hadn't seen a friendly face in 6 months. It was a level of commitment that earned Toby a pass in George's book. for just about any of his other rowdy antics. You can't fake that kind of devotion. And George, who spent his early years playing shows for his fellow soldiers on base, recognized that same fire in Toby's eyes. They often talked about the letters they received from soldiers, stories of how a particular song helped a young private get through a long night on watch, or how a melody reminded a sergeant of his wife back in Texas. These weren't just fans to them, they were family. George's support was often more behind the scenes, working with organizations like the Flaherty's Troops First Foundation to build homes for wounded veterans. Toby was the loud, proud face of the USO, performing over 200 shows for the troops. Together, they represented the two sides of American gratitude: the quiet, steady support, and the loud, defiant cheer. They both understood that their fame was a tool, and there was no better way to use it than to honor the people who made their freedom possible. This shared glue kept them connected even when their musical styles drifted apart. Whenever they got together, the conversation would inevitably turn to the latest troop visit or a specific soldier they had met. It was a grounding force. In the bubble of superstardom, where everyone tells you how great you are, talking to men and women who put their lives on the line is a quick way to find some perspective. George saw Toby's dedication as a badge of honor that outshone any Grammy or CMA award. It was about a code, a set of values that prioritized service over self. When Toby was too sick to travel, one of the things he missed most was that connection to the front lines, and George was one of the few people who truly understood the weight of that loss. Golf, fishing, and the stuff they did when the cameras weren't looking. Off the record. When the lights go down and the tour buses pull out of the arena parking lot, the king and the big dog daddy didn't head for the high society galas or the neon-soaked after-parties in downtown Nashville. Instead, they retreated to a world where the only thing that mattered was the weight of a fish or the arc of a golf ball against a clear blue sky. This was the off-the-record chapter of their lives, a space where the fame was checked at the gate, and they could just be two guys getting older and trying to outdo each other. For George, these moments were essential. He spent his life under a microscope, and having a friend like Toby, who didn't give a damn about George's 60 #1 hits when there was a bet on the table, was his primary source of sanity. Their days off were often spent on the golf course, which is a hilarious image if you think about it. You have George, probably dressed in a coordinated polo, swinging with the same smooth, rhythmic precision he uses to deliver a ballad. Then you have Toby, likely making enough noise to wake the neighbors, wearing something loud, and swinging for the fences like he was trying to drive the ball into the next county. They weren't just playing for fun, they were playing for bragging rights. George has hinted that Toby was a surprisingly good golfer, a guy whose physical size belied a soft touch on the green. But more importantly, the golf course was a sanctuary. It was 4 hours of uninterrupted time where they could talk about their kids, their ranches, and the simple frustrations of getting older in a young man's game. Then there was the water. Both men had a deep, almost spiritual connection to the outdoors, whether it was fishing off the coast of Mexico or sitting by a tank on a ranch in Texas. The water offered a silence that you can't find in a recording studio. George has always been a private person, but Toby was one of the few people who could sit in that silence with him without feeling the need to fill it with noise. They'd trade tips on lures, talk about the weather, and complain about the way the industry was changing. Toby would bring the tequila, his own brand, of course, and George would bring the stories. It was in these quiet moments, away from the fans and the yes men, that their brotherhood truly solidified. These excursions weren't about networking. There were no cameras allowed, no social media posts to engage the fan base, and no publicists lurking in the shadows. It was just raw, unscripted life. George saw a side of Toby that the public never did. The reflective, thoughtful man who worried about his legacy and his family's future. Toby saw the side of George that wasn't the king, the guy who could laugh at himself when he shanked a shot or lost a big fish, right at the boat. This was the fuel that kept their friendship running for decades. It was the realization that, despite the millions of records sold and the private jets, they were happiest when they were just two friends in the middle of nowhere, enjoying the kind of peace that money can't buy. When George talks about Toby now, these are the memories that make his voice crack. It's not the awards ceremonies. It's the quiet afternoon on the water, just waiting for a bite. Why George thinks Toby was the last of a dying breed in Nashville. The Big Dog Legacy. Nashville is a town built on committees. There's a committee for the wardrobe, a committee for the songwriting, and a committee to decide if a singer's hair looks authentic enough for a magazine cover. But when George Strait looks at the empty space Toby Keith left behind, he doesn't see a vacancy for a new star. He sees the end of an era of the self-made man. At 73, George has seen the industry shift from smoke-filled honky-tonks to polished, algorithm-driven pop centers. And in his eyes, Toby was one of the last guys who didn't give a damn about the math. To George, Toby's legacy isn't just about the truckloads of trophies or the stadium tours. It's about the fact that Toby Keith was the chief executive officer of his own soul. He was a big dog because he built his own kennel, and George respected that more than any #1 record. George has often pointed out that people underestimated Toby as a songwriter. Because Toby was so loud and his personality was so oversized, folks sometimes forgot that the man wrote the vast majority of his own hits, something that is increasingly rare in a town where it takes 6 people to write a song about a dirt road. George saw Toby as a throwback to the days of Merle Haggard and Willie Nelson, where the artist and the author were the same person. There was no filter between Toby's brain and the microphone. George, who has made a career out of picking the best songs in the world, admired Toby's ability to conjure a hit out of thin air. It was a raw, blue-collar talent that George believes is being phased out of the modern country machine. But beyond the music, the legacy George sees is one of unapologetic defiance. In a world of safe artists who are terrified of losing a single follower, Toby was a lightning rod. He stood for the working man, the military, and the idea that you should say what you mean, even if it gets you kicked off the guest list at the fancy parties. George watched Toby take the heat for years, and he saw a man who never buckled. To George, that is the true big dog legacy, showing the next generation that you don't have to be a hat act or a puppet to be a legend. You can be loud, you can be wrong, and you can be rough around the edges, as long as you are honest. As the industry moves toward a more sanitized version of country, George worries that the Toby Keiths of the world are going extinct. He sees a landscape where everyone is trying to be baller or brand-friendly, but nobody wants to be the guy who starts a fight for what he believes in. Toby's legacy is a reminder that country music was born in the dirt, not in a boardroom. For the king, Toby wasn't just a friend. He was a guardian of the genre's backbone. Now that he's gone, George feels the weight of that responsibility more than ever. He looks at the young kids coming up and hopes they're paying attention to the way Toby lived, not just the way he sang. Because once that kind of fire goes out, you can't just flip a switch and turn it back on. George looking at his own mortality through the lens of losing Toby. 73 years of wisdom. When you hit 73, your perspective on time starts to shift. For George Strait, those 73 years haven't just been about collecting gold records. They've been about survival in an industry that eats its young. But losing Toby Keith forced a different kind of reflection. It wasn't the usual industry mourning where you post a photo and move on to the next tour date. For George, it was a moment of profound clarity regarding his own mortality and the thin line between being a legend and being a memory. He spent his life as the king, but seeing his younger, boisterous friend taken by a relentless disease made the crown feel a little heavier. It brought home the reality that no matter how many stadiums you sell out, you can't negotiate with time. George has always been a man of few words, but lately, those words carry the weight of a man who knows he's in the fourth quarter. He looks back at the decades spent on the road with Toby and realizes that the glory days weren't about the awards, they were about the survival. Losing Toby was like losing a piece of his own history. It made George realize that his own sunset is on the horizon. At 73, he's not just the king anymore. He's the elder statesman, the last man standing from a specific brotherhood of titans. This wisdom isn't the kind you find in books. It's the kind you find in the quiet of a South Texas morning when you realize your phone isn't going to ring with a loud-mouthed Oklahoman on the other end. He started to speak more openly about the importance of legacy, not the fame kind, but the character kind. Watching Toby face the end with such a stubborn grip on his dignity changed the way George views his own future. He's leaned more into his ranching, his family, and the simple pleasures that Toby fought so hard to keep during his illness. George sees now that the true wisdom of age isn't about knowing all the answers. It's about knowing which questions don't matter anymore. The charts don't matter. The gossip doesn't matter. What matters is the grit you showed when things got tough and the friends you kept along the way. Losing Toby was a wake-up call that even the strongest of us are just passing through. George has taken this lesson to heart, moving with a bit more intention and speaking with a bit more heart. He's no longer just protecting a brand. He's honoring a lifestyle. He knows that he's carrying the torch for both of them now. Every time he steps onto a stage, he feels the absence of that Oklahoma swagger, and it reminds him to appreciate the lights while they're still on. 73 years has taught him that life is a short ride on a fast horse, and having a guy like Toby in the next stall made the journey a hell of a lot more interesting. He's learned that you don't stay the king by being untouchable. You stay the king by remembering the people who made the climb worth it. This realization has softened the edges of the man who was once the most guarded star in Nashville, proving that even a legend can still grow. A simple, powerful closing thought on legendary friendships. So, here's to the Texas king and the Oklahoma outlaw. Here's to the golf games, the fishing trips, the military bases, and the hard truths shared over a cold beer. In a world that's always looking for the next big thing, George Strait is reminding us to hold on to the real thing. Toby Keith may have left the stage, but through the eyes and the voice of his friend George, the music never really stops. It just changes key, heading into a long, beautiful sunset where the grass is always green and the beer is always cold. Ride on, big dog. The king has the watch from here. If you like this video, subscribe to the channel for more interesting accounts on celebrity lives. Thanks for watching.